Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to this new tutorial series in which we're going to deconstruct Arturia's SQ-80 plugin, an emulation of the Ensoniq SQ-80 released in 1988, a classic 80s brash, violent synthesizer. Probably had its most famous moment with the Adamski and Seal song Killer, which you may be familiar with. But it's a really wonderful synth and it's got some fascinating proprietary architecture under the hood, including a pretty early implementation of wavetable synthesis. We're going to have an overview of the synthesizer today and then dive into the oscillator section. If you enjoy this series and you want to help support me and my channel, check out the Patreon link in the description below. There's also a big friendly red join button by which you can become a YouTube channel member. Really appreciate everyone who's signed up so far. Okay, without further ado, let's get on with it. This is the main interface and we see this view when we're in the hardware tab, but frankly it's a view that we're not going to have very often because the vast majority of the time we're going to click the synthesis tab to get basically under the hood. It is very nice to be able to see the implementation of the original synthesizer though. We have some limited access to the oscillators and some of its basic settings from this screen. We also have a really helpful flow diagram over here explaining how the various modules plug together. This stuff is genuinely useful and we will refer to it. Also got some basic arpeggiator options, but as I say, for the most part, we're going to be heading over to the synthesis section where we've got the full functionality, all of the features of the synthesizer are available. As you can see, we've got 3 oscillators. Each oscillator feeds into its own amplifier. Again, having a quick look at the diagram, here they are, 3 oscillators heading into the DCA. Got a little thing over here, this is amplitude modulation, we'll have to have a look at that at some point. All those oscillators then feed into a single filter, onto a final 4th amplifier, which is basically like a master control, allowing us to apply some saturation. You can clip that amplifier quite easily. We've got an effects bank where we can plug in 4 different effects, and you can see on this particular sound we've got some a bit crusher and tape delay effect in use. And then back over in the synthesis section we can see we've got our filter controls. We saw that single filter module, here we are. Some envelopes and low frequency oscillators. We're going to deal with all of those in detail later in the tutorial. Got this pretty quirky mixer control which allows us to combine 2 different modulation sources together to provide really interesting wave shapes. So for instance, I can multiply 2 different low frequency oscillators together to get potentially really interesting wave shapes, and we're going to see implementations and examples of all of this stuff over the course of the tutorial series. There's quite an attractive implementation of modulation connections in this synthesizer. You see all these various different colours. We've got yellows and oranges and pinks and greens. Those colours matter. Each section of the synthesizer has its own colour, and so wherever you see that colour, that section is having an effect. For instance, we've got some yellow over here, which means that I know that this oscillator is being modulated or changed by the low frequency oscillators because they're yellow. Here we've got some pink values, therefore I know that we've got some mapping from our primary keyboard controls. Those are the pink sections. Over the course of this tutorial I'm going to go into much more detail in all of that stuff. What I want to do for now though is throw all of that complexity away because it's a little bit overwhelming at the outset, and get us down to the simplest sound I can possibly generate out of this synthesizer. Here we have a single sawtooth wave with no modulation or effects on it whatsoever. And you hear that pretty raspy sound. Now the reason I've chosen a sawtooth is because they're great for applying modulation to. Sawtooths have lots and lots of harmonics. You can see them in the spectrum analyzer below, and that means we're going to be able to affect this sound really easily, and we're going to be able to see what it's doing very visually. So right back to the beginning, what's an oscillator? Well, it's a thing that makes waves. Waves are what get interpreted in our ears as sound, and so this is a thing that makes sound. Now oscillators can be used for all sorts of different purposes. If you have something generating a wave very, very slowly, then it can be used, for instance, to slowly undulate pitch up and down. We would use a low frequency oscillator to achieve that effect. But here we have audio level oscillators. This thing is rattling along at hundreds of cycles per second. If I press C on my keyboard, have a look at the tuner. 130 Hertz, or there or thereabouts, which means this wave is cycling backwards and forwards at 130 Hertz. The shape that you see in the oscilloscope is the shape of the wave, and it's represented by this shape here. Now, on the face of it, the oscillators in this synthesizer are very basic. There aren't many options to play with. We have an octave control here, which should be pretty self-explanatory. If I press this C again and then increase the octave by 1, just plays a note twice the pitch, or basically 1 octave up. Really obvious. And then we've got a semitone control here. And our fine control knob allows us to increase the pitch in 1/100th of a semitone intervals, and they're called cents. You can see in this particular synthesizer we go down to fractional cents, so that's 1/1000th of a semitone, incredibly small fractions. If I right click on this control, at the moment I'm left clicking, but if I right click I can pull it down in single fractional values. Left click for big sweeping values, right click for really fine control. If I double click on any control on any Arturia synthesizer, it's going to set it back to basically its default value. That might be 0, it might be somewhere in the middle, or it might be 100. So if I double click on this fine control knob, it sets me back to 12 o'clock, which is 0 cents. Each oscillator's wave, we've got 3 of them, goes into an amplifier. This is a digitally controlled amplifier, or DCA. Let's have a look back at our diagram. Here they are. Each oscillator has its own dedicated amplifier, and so we can control the level of that amplifier from here. But the most interesting feature of any oscillator is the ability to change its wave shape or its waveform. We've got different banks of waves here. The standard SQ-80 waveforms are the thing that came with the original synthesizer. And as we scroll down, you can see at the top we've got really traditional sawtooth, sine, square, pulse. These are very basic standard waves. Let's have a look at one of them. Here's our square wave. So called because the shape it draws in the oscilloscope looks like a square. But if we scroll down, we get some more complex wave shapes. But fundamentally, they are all still static waves. It's generating the same shape every single time it cycles round. That's also true for these 2 hidden waves options. This is where you get more esoteric values, and some of them it so happens to be selected on this wave 16 at the moment. If I press the same key that I've been pressing all along on this keyboard, we're not going to hear any sound. This wave only actually generates tone in the upper registers of the keyboard. Now, I'm just guessing here, but I presume that these waves were implemented in the original synthesizer in this way and were used as perhaps modulation effects, I don't know. Some of the waves are spread across the entire keyboard. The reason why I've jumped over trans waves is because they're the most interesting. If we head back to them, this is why the synthesizer is labelled at the front cross-wave synthesizer. This was Ensonic's proprietary implementation of a thing called a wavetable, which basically gives you multiple different wave shapes and your ability to scan through that table of wave shapes dynamically, changing the sound as you do. Now, something to bear in mind with trans waves, or the trans waves table, not all of the waves in this list are actually genuinely wavetable sounds. I'll pick one that is. Let's pick this Dr. X example at the bottom. And we get this slider control. If you look down at the bottom, it says trans wave position. If I press a key on the keyboard and then move this scroll bar, you can see the wave shape change. Now, only waves with -X after it, and actually not even all -X waves. You basically need to just suck it in and see. But the waves with a -X suffix are capable of being trans waves. Now, this one isn't. See, we're getting different behavior here. As I increase the scroll bar, we're not changing the shape of the fundamental wave. We're changing the period of time over which it gets played. Basically, what's happening as I increase this scroll bar is that I'm changing something called the pulse width of the wave. The wave is playing faster, and then there's going to be a period of time when we get a static control voltage coming out of this thing, it translates into a tonal effect. If I pull the scroll bar right down and we just listen to this sound, you'll hear it. So this is pulse wave modulation. This is a different effect. We're no longer wavetable scanning. I'm not the biggest fan of the fact that two different forms of synthesis have been combined into the same menu, but there it is. So you basically just need to go through each of these waves in turn, and as you move the scroll bar, you'll figure out whether or not it's a pulse wave modulation sound or a wavetable sound. So we've got the ESQ bell here, which is clearly a wavetable sound. And there's me scanning through the wavetable. Just one final thing for me to show you before we finish for the day. I'm going to introduce the concept of modulation, and we'll come to discuss it in greater detail in subsequent tutorials. See, as I'm hovering over this DCA, there's a little plus button that appears. This is just an Arturia thing. They love black on black, but there is actually a control in here, if you look very carefully, that when I hover over it, this plus button appears. When I click it, it gives me an opportunity to select a modulation source that allows me to change or modulate this particular effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign the mod wheel to the DCA level. That now means that as I move my modulation wheel up and down, I have the ability to change or modulate the volume of this sound. I'm going to pull the native level down to about halfway. Now, as things stand at the moment, you're not going to get any modulation effect. I'll press a key on the keyboard. It's really quiet because I've turned the level control down, and I'm now turning my modulation wheel up and down, and it's having no effect on the volume whatsoever. We need to dial in a modulation amount in order for this modulation wheel to do any work. And the way that we do that is that we click on the value itself. See, when I hover over it, it says modulation wheel 0. I'm going to left click and then drag up, and then it begins to draw this arc around the modulation value up to a maximum of 1. That basically means that at its maximum extent, the modulation wheel is going to be having the greatest possible modulation effect on this slider. Now you can see the pink line's actually stopped at the top. That's because the level control is somewhere other than 0. So I'm going to choose what my default value is with the level control slider, and then drag the modulation wheel so that when the modulation wheel is at its maximum extent, it's just reached the top level of this slider. See, I was basically controlling it to the point where this pink bar was just hitting the ceiling. It means I'm getting the maximum use out of my modulation wheel. So now I'll pull the mod wheel all the way down, press a key, almost inaudible because it's so quiet. Now I begin turning the modulation wheel up, and you can see a little blue line just here indicating what the current modulated level is. So this is a concept we're going to come across many times in this synthesizer, plugging modulation sources into destinations and then dialing them in to get an amount of thing that we want to happen when we turn that control. And now we get to play a nice game called Hunt the Modulation Source, because if I hover over here we go, I've found them. There are two modulation controls over here. Got pitch mod source 1 and pitch modulation source 2. If I click on one of these and assign this to the modulation wheel as well, now we've got the modulation wheel tied to two different modulation destinations, the volume of the oscillator, but also its pitch. Now as things stand, it's not going to change the pitch because I've not dialed in any modulation amount. Let's do that. And now bring the modulation wheel all the way down, quiet and no pitch change. Start increasing it, and you can see the pitch going up in the tuner and the volume coming up in the output bus. That's one very small example of modulation, but we'll use it many times during this tutorial series. That'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.